Hey guys, how are we all doing tonight? Welcome back to AP Euro CRAM session, week or number 5 at this point. The second of this week, we are on to kind of the real CRAM time now. Going forward, we'll be doing 2 streams a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 o'clock is when they will be happening. We had our first one on Tuesday, where we finished up the tail end of unit number 3. Today, we are going to tackle unit number 4 in its entirety, which is actually not that bad because it's a pretty small unit, all things considered, looking predominantly at the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. On Tuesday of next week, we are going to do the first half of unit 5. Then Thursday, we'll do the second half of unit number 5. We are winding down though now, guys. We are kind of getting to the tail end. In just a few weeks, we'll be taking this darn thing. May 13th, which is a Wednesday, I think, or a Thursday. I'm gonna look at the calendar real quick, actually. May 13th is a Wednesday at 4 o'clock. We will be taking the AP exam. I won't, but you guys will be. So just a heads up, from here on out, 2 streams a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then we're going to end with a rather lengthy stream from 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock, I think. So a 4-hour Q&A session. I'll be in most of the time. It's going to be a slog, but it's going to be great. We're going to be answering lots of questions. So you can kind of pop in and out of that, but that's going to be kind of the last minute, whatever you need to know, we're here to answer. But, so let's go ahead and jump on into it. So today we are going to be covering unit number 4. Unit number 4 is the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Kind of specifically, I like to frame unit 4 as kind of our introduction to the 1700s, Europe in the 1700s. We'll be covering Europe in the 1700s, the tail end of that next Tuesday when we talk about the kind of societal life of Europe in the 1700s, which is we kind of characterize as the old regime. We're going to be doing some old regime introduction tonight. I'm going to talk about Enlightened despotism specifically, but I'll also talk a little bit about generally the 1700s and the old regime. What I will say is that we can kind of look at that as like we start the old regime tonight. Tuesday, we're going to finish up the old regime. That's kind of how I like to think about it, because it's a really long, complicated subject to handle. So I like to spread it out a little bit. But that's enough talking. We can go ahead and jump on into it. So I'm going to make my camera a little bit smaller, make the PowerPoint a little bit larger right there. Okay. Bingo. So as always, guys, if you have questions, throw them into the Ask a Question tab. If you have comments to make when I ask questions and things like that, throw them into the comments tab. But let's go ahead and get started. So not last week, but on Tuesday, we finished up talking about Unit 3. And Unit 3 was absolutism versus constitutionalism. On Tuesday, we talked about constitutionalism. The previous Tuesday of last week, we talked about absolutism. And what I wanted to get out of that was the big overarching themes. And really, when we're thinking about absolutism and we're thinking about constitutionalism, we have to think about a few things in particular. And this is what's going to help guide our talk and our conversation today, especially when we get to the Enlightenment. But when we're thinking about absolutism versus constitutionalism, think about absolutism. Absolutism is the driving mindset of most European monarchs in the 16 and the 1700s. All right, so we focus predominantly on France and on Russia with Louis XIV and Peter the Great. Okay, but we're also going to mention absolutism today when we talk about enlightened despots, because even though they were enlightened despots, they were still absolutists. So we had to think about what was the driving mindset for most European monarchs. And when we talked about constitutionalism, we talked about how there were competing ideologies with absolutism, specifically centered around who holds the power and the role that people play in their government. And with constitutionalism, it was the idea that there should be limits to the power of the king or the one person. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the Enlightenment. I'm going to bring back John Locke and natural rights and all that good stuff. John Locke, even though we don't really consider him part of the Enlightenment, he's a little bit too early for Enlightenment. He still is really important for laying foundations, okay? John Locke lays the foundational support for what will be the Enlightenment. All right, but let's go ahead and jump on into things. So I mentioned this on Tuesday, but I'm going to mention it again. This is our weekly stream calendar. You'll see that right now I'm filling that 9 o'clock AP Euro time slot with the CRAM session. However, there are regular Fiveable streams every night of the week, Monday through Thursday, so Friday excluded, but from Monday through Thursday throughout the week. And these are beyond the CRAM sessions, okay? So you guys can tune into that. There are the social medias that you guys can all follow if you're not already. But this is what we are covering today. And you'll notice that the docket is a little bit shorter than it was last week. Doesn't mean we're covering less content. It just means that there's less sort of like specific points that we need to get through. But broadly, I'm going to talk about Unit 4 as an overview. We'll talk about the Scientific Revolution. We'll talk about the Enlightenment. We'll talk about them together. Can we talk about them together? Are they two separate things? We'll kind of talk about that. And then we're going to do Enlightened Despotism. And I'll end with mentioning two wars of the 18th century that I think you guys should know. They aren't the only wars, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Okay, so that's what we're covering today, and then we'll wrap things up at the end. But let's talk about an overview of Unit 4. So what is included in unit number 4? So broadly, this is Europe in the 18th century. Okay, that's the way I kind of like to contextualize Unit 4 in my head anyway when I'm teaching. And I think it's a good way for you to think about it as well. Unit 5 also predominantly focuses on Europe in the 18th century, but it's the end of the 18th century. All right, Unit 5 is really French Revolution and Napoleon with some old regime stuff thrown in there. Unit 4 is everything scientific revolution leading up to the 18th century, the Enlightenment, which is 18th century, Enlightened Despotism, which is 18th century as well. So broadly, this is what it is, but more specifically, it's scientific revolution, it's Enlightenment, Enlightened Despotism, warfare in the 18th century, and then agricultural revolution, which I threw in there, but I'm actually going to talk about next week and not this week. I was kind of debating when I wanted to talk about it. We're going to talk about it next week, though, so we can put that out of our heads for right now. We'll talk about it next Tuesday. Okay, so broadly, it's Europe in the 18th century. Specifically, it's this stuff. This is Unit 4 and a little bit of Unit 5 as well. But let's go ahead and jump in to the Scientific Revolution. So what was the Scientific Revolution? Really, it's not that hard to understand. You can kind of contextualize what it was. It was an explosion of scientific ideas and theories. It led to the emergence of modern science. One thing I'll say, though, that I think is really important for you guys to understand, excuse me, is that the idea of modern science, someone being a scientist and studying science, that's a modern idea. We actually don't see really the emergence of the word scientist until the 1800s, okay? So really, they would be called natural philosophers, and they were studying natural philosophy. And if that sounds like a little almost like pagan witchcrafty, it's because it borderline was. It was, some of it was anyway, not all of it, but some of it was the kind of like studying of like of almost otherworldly or magical properties in the world. There's this book, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head who wrote it. I think it was Agrippa. I can't remember. It's been a while since I read it in college. But anyway, that talks about natural. It's all based around natural philosophy. It's an incredibly popular book from that time period. And it's this weird mix of like natural, really pretty good science, or maybe not good science, but like real science that we would study today. And then also like, how do we turn iron into gold? How do we do this, and how do we do that? And it's really kind of this out there magical seeming like science. And so it's this really interesting blend of the two of them. What we're going to talk about today, while they would be considered natural philosophers at the time, we we consider them contributing to modern science. But I say all this to tell you that the scientific revolution was a slow-moving process because a lot of these natural philosophers, they got a few things right, but a lot of things wrong. All right, so the first guy we're going to look at, Copernicus. We'll talk about that. We'll say how the thing that Copernicus got right, and then all of the other stuff that Copernicus got wrong. Okay, but this did not happen overnight. And then most of the people that studied science were still considered and considered themselves deeply religious. And then this is really important because the separation of science and religion doesn't really happen for a while. We're about like, when we're talking about Europe now in the 1700s, it's really not until the 1800s. And really, on top of that, the late 1800s that you start to see this big divide between science and religion. All right, we're thinking about more around like Darwin and like Nietzsche, that kind of era. So we're a little bit outside of that range, but most of these guys consider themselves very deeply religious. So why does the scientific revolution happen? Well, first and foremost, this, like all of the other big academic, educational, social movements that happened, that have happened and will happen, are kind of all built off of one another. So why does the scientific revolution happen? Well, because of all the other major social movements that preceded it. So the Renaissance, for example, humanism, the study of the human and the world that the human occupies. That is really important for laying the foundation for scientific exploration. Okay, humanism encouraged human discovery, which led to scientific process. Now, Neoplatonism, which will become a cornerstone of Renaissance thought and idea, based around the ideas of Plato that encourage searching beyond what is seen visibly. Okay, and we know now that a lot of what happens in this world does not happen in a way that we can actually visibly see it. Like we think about the atoms that make us all up, and the molecules, and the idea of elements of things that we can't physically see that make our world so much of what it is. Exploring those things becomes really important for the building of the scientific revolution. Exploration also plays into it as well, upsetting traditional views of the world, right? There's this whole new continent out there that we didn't know about. This goes against a lot of the medieval way of thought that said that everything that was known, or that everything that happens and exists in this world is already known. That's the medieval way of thought, that there's nothing left to understand and to explore. Exploration, it puts a really big question mark on that, because there's a whole huge landmass that exists that we didn't know about, and also encourages further exploration of the natural world. And then Reformation, questioning long-standing beliefs, disrupting the social order of things. Religious leaders are no longer seen as reliable as they were, or religious leaders encourage people to turn to other people with questions that don't have to do with religion. One thing I'll say about Reformation real quick, though, before we move on, is that another thing that it does is that it also encourages literacy rates to increase. A lot of the Protestant religions are going to be practiced in the vernacular. So the Bible is printed in that vernacular, right? We knew this happened with Martin Luther, who he spends a lot of his time when he's in hiding translating the Bible from Latin to German. And then this goes on to encourage other Protestant denominations to also translate their Bibles to their respective languages, whether it's Scottish or French or so on and so on. And so this, with a Bible being in the vernacular, the home language, more people are reading it. More people are not only reading the Bible, they're also reading more things as well. And this brings us in to our next point, which is the printing press. Okay. The printing press was fundamental in allowing scientific ideas to spread quickly and widely. And I love the cartoon I have on here. The copier broke down again, because while it's, I think it's funny anyway, but it also states the problem of life before the printing press was that how were books being produced? Well, people are handwriting them. There was no mass system of producing written text. So really what was being produced or copied? The Bible. That was it. That was the only thing that was produced beyond writing. If you could read or write, you were writing like short little things. You weren't copying books. You weren't mass producing books. Okay. It happened, but not to any sort of great extent. All right. And what this also encourages is that even those with unpopular opinions could print books and articles. All right. This is going to be very important for the scientific revolution because a lot of people who are now we consider very important for laying fundamental groundwork for modern science were not popular when they were around. Copernicus publishes most of his major findings on his deathbed because he doesn't want to get persecuted. And his ideas are kind of laughed out. All right. People don't agree with him. And that's really important because without the printing press, those ideas might not have gotten published. Right. So it allows for people with unpopular opinions to print books and articles. So speaking of Copernicus, let's go ahead and jump on into talking about him. So Nicholas Copernicus is kind of like the first guy we want to think about when we talk about the scientific revolution. He lives from 1473 to 1543. Okay, so he is Renaissance. Okay. Into the modern era, that's the time period that he occupies. All right, so we're looking back in time than from where we are right now chronologically, but we know that the big thing that he did was the heliocentric theory. All right, he was going to challenge the old school Greek Ptolemaic theory that the Earth was the center of the solar system, and the reason why the church held on to the idea that the Earth was the center of the solar system was because it lined up with a lot of the way that they viewed themselves in the universe. That when God created everything, of course, he would make the Earth the center of the solar system. It makes sense. And that is kind of what the church holds on to. And that was the Ptolemaic theory. All right. Ptolemy, who was a Greek mathematician, he proposes this idea and the church holds on to it. Funny enough, Ptolemy would not have been Christian, of course, right? So, but anyway, so Copernicus publishes the heliocentric theory, which he publishes on his deathbed, because he knows that this is not going to be accepted. And in fact, he could get in trouble with the church. So he publishes it on his deathbed. It's not accepted, but his ideas are now out there and people can read them if they so choose. And that's the important part, is that the ideas are out there. But let's go back to that point I made where most people with these ideas were mostly wrong, right? They might have had like nuggets of truth, but a lot of their ideas or their executions were not correct. So let's look at, we've got the Copernican model on the right here. The Copernican model is jacked up. It's got one thing right, the sun being the center of the solar system, but that's it. Okay. The orbits are wonky, right? They're first of all, the perfect circles. We know that they're elliptical orbits. Also, beyond the few celestial bodies that he actually has orbiting the sun, there is just what Copernicus calls the heavens. And really it's all of that area that you can't see with the naked eye. That's the thing that we have to remember, is that a lot of these early scientific theories of the solar system are things that are observed only with the naked eye, because the telescope had not been utilized by Galileo yet to look into the night sky. So Copernicus' model is wrong. It's right in that the sun's the center of the solar system, but more generally, the model is not correct. It will not accurately depict the orbits that the planets have around the sun. Okay, so it's a slow-moving process, right? We have one nugget of truth that will later be changed and altered until we eventually get the whole picture, right? And the whole picture starts or moves forward again with these two guys here, Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. So Tycho Brahe, or Brahe, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. I've said both, and I say both. But anyway, Tycho Brahe does everything in his power to not be relevant for the scientific revolution because he's a hardcore geocentric theorist. Okay. However, the reason why we talk about him is two reasons. One, his kind of like protege pupil is Johannes Kepler, who is going to be very important. And also he conducts the largest amount and most accurate research of the solar system to date. So when he dies, he leaves all of this research that he's done to his protege, to his student, Johannes Kepler. And Kepler is going to go to use this and go on to create the, at the time, most accurate version of our solar system. And so the difference here is that Kepler is a heliocentric theorist, but he couldn't quite figure it out, and he couldn't quite make Copernicus' model work. And eventually he realizes the reason it's not working is because the planets do not move in a perfect circle. In fact, they move in an elliptical orbit, which we can see on the right here at the bottom right. The planets move in ovals around the sun. All right. And that, all of a sudden, it makes sense. And in fact, Kepler says it was as if I had awakened out of a sleep, because all of a sudden there's a big aha moment. Everything makes sense. This is the way that the solar system works. Okay. And so this is going to eventually give us to Kepler's 3 laws. And Kepler's 3 laws are going to also further explain this growing idea that happens throughout the 1600s into the 1700s. And it's the idea that everything in the universe operated according to basic mathematical principles. And so we have Kepler's 3 laws. We're also going to have, kind of certainties that other scientists are going to make about the way that the world works. And so Kepler's 3 laws are: 1, the planets move in an elliptical orbit around the sun. This was his great awakening, his big aha moment. The planets' velocity varied depending on their distance from the sun. Okay, so planets move closer or faster when they're closer and slower when they're farther away. Physical relationships between moving planets could be expressed mathematically. The mathematical harmony of the universe is going to be one of the big crucial defining moments for modern science, right? Because we know that modern science today, especially things like physics and chemistry, is based around these ideas that we can actually mathematically calculate the way that things happen, right? If I fire this arrow out of a bow, I can calculate where that arrow is going to land based on, the strength at which I pull it back, the velocity, so on and so on. It's been a while since I've taken physics, so excuse me. But that idea of physics starts here, right? This idea that the Earth and the world and everything operates according to mathematical principles. Now, the thing I will say about Kepler, and Kepler even says this, he says, look, I don't understand why those last 2 points, and really why all 3 points are true. Kepler can never explain why they happen. He just knows them to be true, right? He creates a model, and the model works. So he knows them to be true, but he cannot actually explain it. And it's going to be Isaac Newton who does that explaining. But talking about the mathematical harmony of the universe, we can now start introducing Galileo Galilei. Believed that the world could be described in purely mathematical terms, moving away from the medieval way of viewing the world. But Galileo Galilei, Kepler, these guys were not the norm in any way. Okay, so let's talk about Galileo right now, because he is definitely like the curmudgeon guy who's ready to shake up the system. He is definitely the troublemaker, I think, in all of the people we're talking about now. So Galileo is the first to make new discoveries of the universe, and famously he uses the newly invented telescope, an instrument that was used not for looking up, but for looking around you. He takes the basic principles of the newly invented telescope, creates his own, builds his own specifically for looking at the night sky, and he points the telescope up. And when he does this, a whole new vision of the night sky is introduced to him. He discovers things like craters on the moon, moons around Jupiter, spots on the sun. Yes, Galileo did stare at the sun through a telescope. And yes, he was almost completely blind by the time that he died. Don't stare at the sun through a telescope. But he makes all of these discoveries. And this further upsets the traditional way of viewing the world and viewing the solar system. And Galileo is famously going to rub up against the church. He takes his ideas public in 1610 and 1632, respectively. That's when he releases his two books. And he really heavily criticizes those that believed in the old way of thinking, this way that the old way being that the world and everything had already been uncovered, so there's no need to look any further into it. He criticized those who believed that way, and really pretty heavily criticized them. And he is going to be put on trial by the church. In Dialogue of the Two Chief Systems of the World, he explains, kind of further backs up the Copernican model, I guess I should say, that the sun is the center of the universe. He talks a lot about his final findings, and he further goes on to kind of like push against the old way of thinking. Now we have to think about the world in which Galileo is occupying and why, as I've said here, that the Copernican model is widely accepted at his death. Look at his dates. Look at the times in which he's living in. 1564 into 1642. By the time that he is dead, we are already well into the Reformation, and people have already started to question their traditional values. All right. So Galileo comes around at the perfect time to present more things that upset the traditional worldview. If he had lived 100 years earlier, or heck, if he had lived even 50 years earlier, that might not be the case, right? Think about if he died, in 1520 instead of 1642. The world might not have been ready yet, okay? Even though Martin Luther is doing this thing, the world might not be ready yet. So it's really important that when we think about why was Galileo able to do the things he did, he was able to because of the time in which he occupied. He's able to because of the time period in which he actually lives. Okay, so that's really important when we think about this kind of stuff. So there we go. There's our boy Galileo staring at the night sky, staring at the sun with a telescope. Now we need to talk about Newton. Before we do that, we do have a question. Okay, so the question is, how does Galileo's discoveries challenge the old view? That is a really good question. So I'll give you a general answer, and then I'll give you some specific pieces, some specific answers as well. So generally, the reason why Galileo's ideas challenge the traditional views is because he is seeing things that were not seen previously. Okay, when he points his telescope up to the night sky, he sees the planets beyond the planets that we can just see with our naked eye. Those planets that can only be seen through a telescope. He also sees stars that occupy seemingly black places of the night sky that are there, but again, only there when seen through a telescope. And that idea that those things exist, but we can't physically see them, upsets the worldview that we already know everything about the world. He pretty much says, no, we don't know everything about the world, and here is why. Now, he also does butt heads with the church. While he was, again, presenting these kind of new views of the world and challenging the old established views that the church had established, he also is just generally kind of a jerk to the church, and he really is trying to like get their goat and cause problems. But he is doing things like saying that there are craters on the moon, and if you see the moon in the night sky, while it's not a perfect white, there's like blotches on it where you can't see those like physical craters unless you look through a telescope. And he sees those physical craters, and he can see that the moon is in fact not perfectly round. And believe it or not, this is actually a really big sticking point, because a lot of the rhetoric of the church, especially in the Middle Ages, is that the moon is this perfect circular celestial body that orbits the Earth. And Galileo challenges that idea. Okay, so that's what I mean by challenging the old view, is that's what Galileo's views do, is by seeing things that weren't there previously. Okay, good question, though. Very good question. All right, so let's talk about Newton. And Newton, let's look at his dates real quick. He is going to live from 1642 to 1727. So this is definitely our guy. You know, he almost exists within the Enlightenment, but a little bit before that. Now, Newton is going to be kind of the I'll say he's different. He's different than the rest of the guys we talked about, because Newton, when he lives and by the time he dies, Newton is a rock star. I mean, he gets knighted, you know, for Christ's sake. He's Sir Isaac Newton. He is very popular by the time that he dies, which can't necessarily be said about the rest of the guys that we talked about. Okay, so Newton is a good example of the way that the world is heading in. People are more open and accepting of these new ideas. But generally, he also makes some of the most important discoveries during the Scientific Revolution. All right, he makes, in fact, 3 significant discoveries here. Okay, first, he invents calculus. All right, so if some of you guys are taking calculus right now, you can blame Newton for that. But generally, this is the basis of all the way that we do modern math. Also, the law of composition of light, which leads to the science of optics. Famously, what Newton does is he gets a prism, which is just a kind of bent piece of glass, and he creates a pinhole light in his window. So he hangs up a dark piece of cloth and makes a pinprick piece of light, so a beam of light shines through, and with the prism he's able to bend the light. And it's this idea that light is not just something, it's something physical that can be altered, is going to lead to the creation of optics and modern optics. So he does that, and then of course is the law of gravitation, a force of attraction existing between two bodies and increasing as the bodies move closer. And this is how we can now explain why our solar system acts the way that it does. And there's the story, of course, the kind of the legend of the apple falling on Newton's head, and that's his big aha moment that gravity exists, right? And he explains the idea of gravity and the mathematical principle of the natural world. You guys don't need to know these specific titles of the works. I would say with someone like Newton, just know what he did, but you only need to know the titles. Okay, so generally that wraps up the Scientific Revolution. I think that when you're thinking about people that you need to know from the Scientific Revolution, you need to know Copernicus, you need to know Kepler, you need to know Galileo, and you need to know Newton. I would say even if you just know 3 of those guys, you're in good shape. And I would bet that most of you guys, that's not a big deal because you've learned about them in history or science previous to taking AP Euro. So yeah, I would say that. But generally, also when you think about the Scientific Revolution, why is it important? Because it pushes Europe to start thinking very critically about the natural world and the space that humanity occupies. And that's going to be really important when we get to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is like the Scientific Revolution, but for society. There is definitely this era of science that exists within the Enlightenment, but it's mostly focused on how does humanity interact with the society that humanity lives in. Okay. So let's talk about the Enlightenment. So what are the roots of Enlightenment? Well, the major reasons why the Enlightenment happens is, one, the popularization of science. Like I said, by the time that Newton is dead in the early 1700s, 1727, by the time that he is dead, he is a rock star, and his ideas of studying the natural world are also very, very popular. You start to see in a lot of schools the introduction of studying science and studying the natural world, right? Early scientific studies are going to become very, very popular. Also, growing skepticism to traditional authority. This can be seen in the Reformation. It can be seen in the Scientific Revolution, but it can also be seen in things like the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution is a really good buildup for understanding the Enlightenment in places like England. The expansion of print culture. Like I said, high increased literacy rates. Everybody gets to write about whatever they want to write about, and they can print it, even if they're unpopular. The rise of globalization and access to new cultures is also going to be very, very important here. We'll talk a little bit about what I mean when we actually get through to talking about some specific enlightened philosophers. But really, when we're thinking about the roots of enlightenment, we can think about these 4 reasons. And these are the same 4 reasons that we kind of used or the same general reasons when we talked about the scientific revolution, right? This isn't new. And if we think about the way that we've been talking about Europe and European society and the kind of like the way that Europeans think of themselves, it makes a lot of sense that this would happen, right? It makes sense that eventually we would get to this point where people are thinking about and criticizing the world and that they live in and the society that they live in, right? When we think about someone like John Locke is pre-Enlightenment, right? He's not within kind of that time period of Enlightenment, but John Locke is a guy who talks about how people can and should hold their government responsible, and that's really, really important. So the popularization of science, both Newton and Galileo had a huge influence on the world and their ideas of science. Newton has his law of gravity, Galileo with his popularization of the heliocentric theory. And both stress the importance of using empirical evidence. And empirical evidence is really, you guys have been using empirical evidence when you talked about science forever. Empirical evidence is just having a theory and then testing that theory and using the data or those tests to prove your theory correct. Having evidence that you can physically see. It's the scientific method, right? The use of empirical evidence is just simply the scientific method. And the scientific method and the use of empirical evidence is actually going to be very, very important for the Enlightenment, because empirical evidence is going to be a way that a lot of people are going to say, this is the way that society should be set up. Society should be set up because of X, Y, and Z. All right. And these are things that we've witnessed and we've seen. Now, major philosophical changes also occurred during the Scientific Revolution. So Francis Bacon, we kind of include within the Scientific Revolution, even though Bacon himself said very clearly, I am not a scientist. Bacon was not a scientist. He did not delve into science in the same way that those other guys did. But Bacon is going to talk a lot about the need for science and also the need and the importance of empirical evidence and applying empirical evidence. And like Galileo, he's going to heavily criticize those that were stuck in their old way of thinking. Rene Descartes is going to be another person who is wrapped up in the scientific revolution, even though he contributes more to the philosophy of science as opposed to science itself. I mean, he does a lot of really important things. So I don't have it in here, but he creates a whole entire mathematical style. But he is mostly known for his skepticism and his famous saying, "I think, therefore I am." But he is going to generally introduce this idea of deduction. Okay, so using what you already know to kind of deduce an answer. We use deduction all the time in not only science, but also in history as well, right? If we try to deduce an answer, we're going to try to work through and answer questions that we can already answer before we get boiled down to answering the bigger question that we had in the first place. Rene Descartes is a really interesting guy. And I'll give a brief history of him because he's really pretty wild. So Rene Descartes was one of those guys that is just like, his mind was like constantly on. His mind was constantly turned on, and he was kind of always thinking about himself and the world in which he occupied. And he has this moment at some point in his life where he has this huge, big, like crisis moment where he says, how do I know that any of this is real, that I am actually living in a physical world right now? And he says, we don't actually know that some evil deity is creating the world that I actually see. And this really, really troubles him, and he can't move past it. And so what he does is he actually decides to try to figure out if he can deduce an answer to this question that he has. Is any of this real? And what he does is he says what he's going to do is he's going to go through everything that he thinks he knows to be true, try to figure out if it's actually true to get to an answer. And eventually he gets to the point that he says, because I am a thinking being living in the world, I exist. I think, therefore I am. Okay. And then with that, he's able to kind of deduce that, yes, this is actually real and that this is actually really happening. So Rene Descartes, probably a joy at parties, but really important for bringing in deduction into science. And then, of course, Hobbes versus Locke, the challenging of society and the role that people play in their government, which I've talked a lot about already, so I'm not going to dig into it. So, like I talked about with the Scientific Revolution, the turmoil of religion leads to the questioning of traditional authority. So I'll throw a few names out here just to kind of give you guys examples. But Pierre Bayle, a French Huguenot who flees during the reign of Louis XIV, he goes and attacks the intolerance of France and the Catholic Church more generally. He argues that clear observations of the natural world are more rock solid than Scripture. So this guy was not on the Catholic Church's good side. But also argued, and this is the real kicker here, that morality and religion are independent from one another, meaning that just because you're religious doesn't mean you're a good person. All right. So Pierre Bayle, not on the church's good side, but arguing a lot of points that are going to be further argued during the Enlightenment. David Hume, who does exist within the Enlightenment, he is going to kind of take things a huge step further, and he's going to say that we really can't know anything is true. He says not even the existence of God can be known for sure. And this is going to bring us into how Enlightenment thinkers thought of religion, because the reality is that a lot of these guys, they were still religious, even if they weren't necessarily subscribing to Catholicism or Lutheranism or Calvinism, whatever. They were still religious. And so we see the idea of deism is created. And deism, really simply, is just the idea that God was a clockmaker. He created the world. He created everything in it. He wound it. He got it going. And then he just walked away. And that he has not interfered with the world or its people since he created it. And that's deism. And the reason why deism is important is because it allows for a lot of these guys to still remain deeply religious, but not contradict the ideas that they were putting forth, which in a lot of ways were not religious at all. So, interesting point there. Also, the development of print culture increased the production of secular works. In the end of the 1600s, over half of all printed works in Paris are religious. By 1780, though, only 10% of printed works are religious. Paris is going to be a hotbed for non-religious printed works. And then this is just more generally going to increase literacy across Europe, especially in major cities. On top of this, mass production of newspapers is going to really help to make sure that governments do what they say they're going to do and don't go unchecked. So especially places like England is going to, and France as well, England and Paris. And I say Paris, I'll talk about the difference between Paris and France as a whole next Thursday when we talk about the French Revolution. But in places like Paris and London and Berlin, mass productions of newspapers are going to be really important for keeping governments in line. The access to new culture, with the increased print came new and different cultures. European philosophers, they began to study and read about customs of China and the Middle East. Confucianism and Buddhism are going to be really popular points of study for a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, because they were just so drastically different than religion in Europe. So people like Montesquieu and Voltaire, who I'll talk about more in detail here in just a second, they both heavily criticize European culture, especially the culture of France. And they argue that in France, no one can think freely for themselves. And in fact, it lacks good morals and an effective government. And they kind of look at England as being the perfect example of what a government should be, that constitutional-based government. Needless to say, Voltaire especially, Voltaire is going to be constantly just kind of moving around Europe because he keeps getting kicked out of countries that he's living in. But all of this to say that there was a lot of a questioning of the way that things are done and the ways that things should be done. Now, before we move on to our last little bit of content here, I want to talk about who you should actually know from the Enlightenment. So what I just covered was the causes of the Enlightenment. Why did it happen? I now want to talk about who should you actually know from it. So I have a relatively short list. I think it's like 6 people you should know. And I'll explain why you should know them, what their major ideas are. So first is Voltaire. Voltaire is like the stereotypical Enlightenment philosopher. He is probably the best person to know for the Enlightenment just because so many of his ideas represent basic ideas of the Enlightenment. Okay. So first of all, one of the core principles of the Enlightenment more generally is religious toleration and civil liberties. And Voltaire is going to write extensively about both of these. That's one of the things, especially when you're like writing your DBQ, one of the things that College Board loves to see is when you're writing about the Enlightenment, that you understand the core basic ideas of what the Enlightenment actually is. So I think religious toleration and civil liberties, those are core beliefs of the Enlightenment, core kind of foundational components of the Enlightenment. And Voltaire talks about and writes about both of those at great lengths. So he's really good to know for that. Rousseau, I think, is probably the second most important person to know just because he's going to have such a big influence on the French Revolution. But Rousseau, he writes about social contracts and civil society. So he famously writes his book, The Social Contract, which he argues that it's society that corrupts the individual, and that the individual is only really perfect and free when living in a state of nature. He pretty much takes John Locke's ideas and bumps it up to 11. He also writes a lot about education in his book Emile, where he talks about the purpose of like the purpose of inquiry-based education and how education should ideally be set up. But Rousseau is going to have a huge impact on the French Revolution, so he's good to know. Denis Diderot, he writes the Encyclopedia, so access to knowledge, which is another cornerstone of the Enlightenment, is good to know there. So Denis Diderot writes the Encyclopedia, good example of access to knowledge. Cesare Beccaria, he writes a lot about criminal justice and the use of ethical punishment. So he famously writes against the death penalty. And says that it's inhumane and it's not ethical. So he talks about criminal justice reform. That's his big idea. Montesquieu, he writes about the separation of powers. That's his ideas are going to be applied with the United States when they write the Constitution or ratify the Constitution in 1789. So Montesquieu and his ideas of separation of powers and government are another cornerstone of the Enlightenment. And he's I think probably, when you're thinking Enlightenment politics, he's the guy to know. And then lastly is Mary Wollstonecraft. She writes a lot about equality for women, and she's kind of, again, one of our early European feminists. So I think if you know these 6 guys, or even if you know 4 of the 6, you're in really good shape. And this is generalized. I would recommend going in and digging a little bit deeper into whichever ones that you want to focus on, just because they're good evidence to bring in. If the DBQ happens to be about the Enlightenment, or if the DBQ, even if the DBQ is about the French Revolution, bringing in some of these guys is really good for that. But with that being said, let's say switch gears and talk about enlightened despotism. Okay, so this is the last little bit of content that we're going to cover. We are focusing more on political Europe. So I'm going to show this map again when we do old regime on Tuesday of next week. And I showed this map, I think, also, or a similar map to this on Tuesday of this week. But this is what Europe looks like in the 1700s. Okay, today we're going to focus a lot on Central and Eastern Europe. We're going to look at Russia, Prussia, and Austria today. So let's first talk about Catherine the Great. So Catherine the Great, she is going to make herself, well, she's going to be made czaress in 1762. She doesn't make herself czar. The nobles make her czar. But her story is really, really interesting, okay? And I want to tell it real quick because her story is so absolutely wild. So following the death of Peter the Great, you have a series of very ineffective, unsuccessful rulers in Russia. And eventually, you get to the rule of Peter III. And Peter III is married to Catherine here, who Catherine is actually not even Russian. She's German. She's a German princess that is married to Peter III. And when she gets to Germany, or to Russia, excuse me, she has this kind of like sink or swim moment where she sees the Russian court and she sees how dangerous it can be. And she says, I need to fully embrace being Russian if I'm going to survive any of this. And so she takes great lengths to not only learn to speak Russian, but also write Russian, to learn Russian cultures, and all of that stuff. And in fact, it is said, or the nobles said, that she, in fact, was more Russian than her husband was, Peter III, who was actually Russian. And Peter III was not a good ruler. He suffered from a series of mental problems, and he's just was not a very weak, or not a very strong czar. And the nobility, what they come to Catherine the Great and they say, look, how would you feel about being czaress? And she says, yeah, sure. And the nobility, in the middle of the night, they round up Peter III and they kill him. And with that, Catherine the Great is made czar. And so Catherine the Great is put on the throne, and she becomes one of the most important Russian rulers ever. And she really considers it, excuse me, she really considers herself to be an enlightened despot. And what I mean by enlightened despot is that she tried to rule and govern according to enlightened principles. So she embraced things like educational reform. She attempted legal code reform. I will say her legal code reform ultimately failed. Her educational reform, though, was pretty great. She opens up schools not only across Russia, but also to women. But her foreign policy is going to be decidedly not enlightened. It resembled her absolute ruler mindset. And that's one thing, is that even though these guys and girls were enlightened despots, they were still absolute rulers. And the partitioning of Poland is a very, very good example of this. The partitioning of Poland happens from 1772 to 1795, in which Poland is divided up among Russia, Austria, and Prussia across three separate instances. And this really happens because Prussia lacked a strong central government. It was still a country that was dominated by its nobility. So as a country as a whole, it was very, very weak. And what happens here is these three countries pretty much gobble up territory until by 1795, with the last partitioning, Poland is eradicated. It's gone. We'll talk about Poland, though, because Poland is not going to exist again until the end of World War I in 1918. But we'll talk about Poland because they become a very important country or group of people when it comes to nationalism. But this is decidedly not enlightened, right? This is not self-determination. This is not civil liberties, right? This is absolutism in its fullest right here. Frederick the Great rules from 1740 to 1786. Frederick the Great of Prussia, I'll say, considers himself also an enlightened despot. He is going to attempt enlightened reforms, including codification of the laws, abolishing torture, ending capital punishment. He also does increase religious toleration, going so far as to say that if Muslims want to move to Prussia, he'll build them mosques. Now, he never actually does this, but he was pretty religiously tolerant. However, like Catherine, he had some not so enlightened policies. One, he heavily taxed Jews, considering them useless to the state. So some anti-Semitism thrown in there. Just as to put it out there, anti-Semitism is something that had been around Europe really since like the Crusading era. It's not before that. So this is an example of that anti-Semitism. And he made no attempt to free or reform serfdom at all. He really didn't care about that. And Catherine the Great, same way, did not try to free or reform serfdom. So, again, some enlightened policies, some not enlightened policies. Now, Joseph II, his story it's kind of sad. He's really one of these rulers that is just, it's a sad story, but he is arguably, out of the three, the most enlightened of the enlightened despots. He believed in a state that was governed by reason. He also saw himself deeply as the servant of the state. It was not his job for his people to work for him. It was his job to work for his people. Kind of the modern idea of like what a good leader should be is someone who wants to work for their country. But also his reforms are going to be really pretty radical. Probably the most radical reforms of any monarch in the 18th century, maybe of even the 19th century, and maybe not quite that, but definitely of the 18th century. So giving full legal privileges to serfs, fully embracing religious toleration, making education compulsory for all citizens, girls and boys. Centralizing and modernizing medicine. In fact, he condenses, in Vienna, he condenses all the hospitals into a single massive hospital in the middle of the city. It's still around today, by the way, interestingly enough. But generally, all of these reforms that he proposes fail. None of them really work besides, kind of the bones of a few of them, like compulsory education and centralizing medicine. He gets no support from his nobility. He gets no support from his people. In fact, even his closest advisors, by the time he's on his deathbed, his closest advisors had abandoned him. And he really kind of dies. He dies really feeling like he didn't accomplish anything. Really, really pretty sad. And in fact, on his tombstone he's buried in the big, Habsburg crypt. On his tombstone, it says, "Here lies Joseph II." This is not a joke. Here lies Joseph II, who failed at all he tried or all he did. That's true. That's written on his tombstone. Really pretty sad, but important ruler for trying out these really radical reforms, but just moved too fast and came too soon. Existed too soon in the world that he lived. All right, last thing we're going to talk about are these two wars that I think you guys should know. Prussia versus Austria. So these are conflicts between Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa, who's the mother of Joseph II. They take the throne the same year, and Maria Theresa's authority is questioned because she's a woman. And this is going to lead to two major conflicts that I think are important for you guys to know. The first is the War of Austria Succession, 1740 to 1748. Frederick the Great invades Silesia, a province of, or a part of Austria. He invades it, and I'm pretty much to provoke a war with Austria, which works. And Austria and Prussia go to war. And what ends here is pretty much a stalemate. Prussia keeps Silesia, but that's pretty much it. But the 7 Years' War is probably the most important war of the pre-French Revolutionary Wars of the 1700s. This is going to be the French and Indian War in the United States. This was, again, Prussian aggression, invades Saxony, and a coalition is formed to stop him. Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden join a coalition against him. The British are actually funding Frederick the Great here, which is why the French and the British fight in the United States. But this war ends generally in a stalemate, with each side being tired of fighting. I'll mention the 7 Years' War a little bit next week, but these are just generally two good wars to know for the 1700s. But I am over my time, so I am going to go ahead and wrap things up. So how should we think about and talk about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment? I think the big takeaway here is that we need to think about how are these things going to impact future events in Europe? And also, how are these a reaction to what has already happened in Europe, right? So when we think about the French Revolution would not have happened if it wasn't for the Enlightenment. It wouldn't have happened in the way it did anyway. People questioning their governments and having the courage and the place to question that and actually do something about it. So the Enlightenment is absolutely a reaction to absolutism. It's a reaction to Reformation. It's a reaction to Renaissance. And it's going to have massive rippling impacts on history. And in fact, the basic way that we think about ourselves in the world that we live in large part is because of the Enlightenment. So I encourage you guys to go back and take a look at the those people, that 6 people I mentioned, dig a little deeper into them so you guys have a good understanding, because those are good pieces of evidence to know for your DBQ. But it's 10 o'clock. I'm going to end there. That's Unit 4 in a nutshell. Next Tuesday, we will be covering Part 1 of Unit 5. That is predominantly focused on the old regime, looking at the society of the old regime. And then on Thursday is going to be a big bad one, French Revolution and Napoleon. We're going to roll through probably the craziest 20 years of European history ever in an hour. So make sure you guys are tuning in for that one. I appreciate you guys coming by and stopping by. As always, send me an email if you have questions. You can tweet at me as well. This will be posted on Fiveable right now. I'm getting off, so if you want to go back and review tomorrow, you certainly can. I hope you guys have a wonderful night and a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you guys very, very soon.